Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mishnah In-Depth Keilim with Rabbi David Silber. We're starting off a new tractate for this summer. This course is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Memorial Mishnah Division. We are following the standard Mishnah Yomit calendar of learning 1 to 2 mishnayot each day independently. For this tractate, we will come together about 3 times once a month to review what you've been learning on your own. Over periods of weeks and months of study, we will complete tractates and even entire orders of Mishnah. It's a pleasure to learn with Rabbi Silber, who is the dean and founder of Drisha. Rabbi Silber, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, the tractate is called Keilim. It is the longest tractate in the Mishnah. It's 30 chapters. The truth is that often it's divided into 3 sections: Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra. The first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate, similar to what we encountered when we looked at Nezikin. There's Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, which is actually known as Tractate Nezikin. So Nezikin is 30 chapters long and divided into 3 sections of 10 apiece. The Tractate Keilim is similar in that respect. It's 30 chapters long, often divided into the first gate, second gate, and third gate. 30 chapters. The Tosefta of Keilim, there is no Gemara on Keilim. There's virtually no Gemara on Tarot at all, except for Masechet Nida, but there's a Tosefta, and that's about 25 chapters. It's not 10 and 10 and 10. In any event, Tractate Keilim is the first Masechta of Tarot. Now, Tarot deals with Tumah and Tara, ritual purity, ritual impurity. It's quite a complex system, and Tarot is by far, within the 6 Sidarim of the Mishnah, Tarot is by far the longest. And it's also the most difficult in the sense that, and the great challenge of learning Tarot is that Keilim, for example, talks about different implements that either can or cannot become ritually impure. We'll get to some of those details later, but the challenge in learning Tarot, apart from some of the complexity of the categories, is to understand exactly what kind of vessels the Mishnah is talking about. The hundreds and hundreds of different vessels that the Mishnah talks about, and really sometimes it's very hard to know exactly what it looks like. There are some illustrations, etc., etc. That's one of the main challenges. In any event, we have Seder Tarot. Now, Seder Tarot consists of 12 tractates. The Rambam, who wrote a commentary on the Mishnah in general, also has an introduction to Seder Tarot. In the introduction, he gives an explanation as to the order of these 12 tractates. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but when you read it, he tries to justify it. And on the other hand, his justification seems to me, at least, is sometimes rather forced, or certainly not something that is obviously the case. And what is interesting, though the Rambam spends in his introduction some time on explaining why the various Masechtot of Tarot are in this order, when the Rambam himself, in his Mishnah Torah, has one of the 14 books devoted to Tumah and Tara, it's called Tara, he has a completely different order, totally different order. And the order of the Rambam, not surprisingly, makes total sense. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the reality is that, and this is well known, that in general, the most cogent explanation as to the order of the various tractates within a Seder has to do with size order. So Keilim is 30 chapters long. It's the longest tractate. And generally speaking, they go in size order. The last one is called Yadayim, talks about hands becoming ritually impure, not the entire body, just the hands. And that's a short tractate. So generally speaking, it's in size order. Although in the Talmud, very often the Talmud will ask, why does one tractate follow another? And they don't talk about size order. They never talk about size order. They give different explanations, and the Rambam, in that respect, follows the Talmud. He never suggests that the various tractates are in size order. Now, having said that, Keilim is the first tractate, and actually, it's a very strange choice, leaving the size out for now. Any other explanation seems very strange, because what you would expect is an order such as the Rambam himself has in the Mishnah Torah. When the Rambam, he has 8 different sections in his discussion, in his code of Mishnah Torah, and he starts with Tumat Meit. He starts with the tumah that comes from coming in contact with a corpse. And the reason for that is clearly that for the Rambam, for the Mishnah, for the Talmud, the most significant source of impurity in our tradition is the corpse. So it just so happens that the first chapter of Keilim is a discussion over 30 chapters of what kind of vessels can contract impurity, which, of course, is not the way one would normally start. One would start normally, as the Rambam does, with sources of impurity. But the Mishnah we have starts with Keilim, but the first chapter of Keilim can be seen as an introduction to the Seder of Tarot in general. Because in the first chapter of Tractate Keilim, very special chapter, it talks about 2 things. It talks about sources of impurity. There are sources, what can cause something else to be impure. And the Mishnah lists a whole bunch of different things. And then the Mishnah lists them in order, from less severe to most severe. And in this list of things that can cause impurity, sources of impurity, the last on the list, the most powerful source of impurity is the corpse. The corpse. And when I say the most powerful, in a moment I'll explain what that means for the Mishnah, what that means for Seder Tarot in general. And that's where the Rambam started in Mishnah Torah, Tamei made. But what's interesting is the list of sources of impurity and ordering them covers the first 5 mishnayot of chapter number 1. But when you get to Mishnah number 6, the Mishnah says, Eser Kedushotem. There are 10 different levels of sanctity. And the Mishnah has 10 different levels of sanctity. The highest level of sanctity is the Holy of Holies of the temple. So the Mishnah itself suggests that there's some connection, there's some relationship between Tumah and Kedusha. I'll come back to that later. That's a very, very important point. Tumah and Kedusha. Now, let me come back now to sources of Tumah. So first of all, what's important to understand is that Tumah, ritual impurity, can be passed on from one thing to something else. And there are all kinds of rules about what can cause something else to become ritually impure. In general, a main source of impurity is called an Av HaTumah. An Av being little father, but it means that the main category, the source. And something which is impure, which is an Av HaTumah, can pass Tumah down to something else. And typically, when something comes into contact, one of the ways things can become ritually impure themselves is through contact. And when something comes into contact, let's say with an Av HaTumah, the thing that comes in contact becomes a Rishon L'Tumah, a Rishon. So, for example, if a person would touch certain dead rodents are considered avatoma. There are 8 of them listed in the Torah, or Shmona Shratzim. If a person would touch one of these dead rodents, that person would become a Rishon L'Tumah. If a vessel would touch a dead rodent, the vessel would become a Rishon L'Tumah. And what about if a Rishon touches something else? Can you become, or what can become, a Sheni? And in the system, actually, a person or a vessel typically cannot become a Sheni L'Tumah. But what can become a Sheni L'Tumah is a food or a drink, an ochel or a mashke. So if a vessel touched an avatoma, that became a rishon, and if the vessel then came in contact with a food or a drink, that food or drink can become a sheni l'tumah. So there's an avatoma, there's a rishon l'tumah, and there's a sheni l'tumah. What about if the sheni l'tumah touches something else? So typically, I say typically because there are exceptions to everything, but typically, a sheni cannot make a shlishi. If a food which has become ritually impure through contact with a rishon, and that food touched something else, a different food or a different drink, that would not become a shlishi. Shlishi does not exist, except it doesn't exist with normal kinds of food, but it does exist, but something which has sanctity to it, such as, for example, truma. Truma is the part of the food that's given to the Kohen, which has a certain sanctity. And if truma came into contact with a sheni, it becomes a shlishi. That's only true of truma. That's not true of non-truma food, of normal food. It's even possible to have a revi if the truma came in contact with something which has kedusha, sacrifice, something related to sacrifices. There we have a revi. Those are exceptions to the rule. Normally there's a av, there's a rishon, and there's a sheni. And the way you contract tumah typically is by coming in contact, what's called maga, touching. The exception to this rule, all the rules there are exceptions and all kinds of complications, but there's something that's even more than an avatuma, and that is the corpse itself. The corpse itself is known as avi avotatuma, father of the father. If a person would touch a corpse, that person becomes an avatuma, not a rishon. That person becomes an avatuma. Now, there are other exceptions too, and maybe we'll touch upon this in one of the next 2 classes about Keilim and Tarot in general. But I come back to the Mishnah of chapter 1, which states clearly that the most severe tumah is tumat mate, tumah identified with a corpse. And tumat mate has other special features that the other tumot do not have. I'll mention 2 of them. One is the way you contract tumah from a corpse. And that is, normally you contract tumah by contact, by touching. For some of the tumot, you can contract tumah by transporting it or by carrying it. Even if you don't touch it, you can transport something without touching it, and that, in some cases, in the case of the corpse or some other tumot, that would make you tamei as well. But what is special about tumat mate is you don't have to carry or touch it to become tamei. If you're in the same space as a corpse, you also become tamei. That's called tumat ohel. That's tumat ohel. So that's special to tamei mate. We don't have another tumah which you can contract the tumah by simply being in the same space, with one possible exception, which is not our province right now, which is not identical to tumat ohel but similar, and that has to do with the mitzora, usually translated as the leper, some kind of skin disease. There's a whole long in Seder Tarot, there's a whole discussion about Tumat Tzarat, has all kinds of special features, and there's some kind of a Tumat Oel related to Tzarat. That's not our province right now. But Tumat Mate has Tumat Oel. Tumat Mate is a tumah when you touch it, you are impure for 7 days. We have that with some other tumot as well. But what's unique to Tumat Mate is the way one becomes tahar, the purification rite. The purification rite of the Tamei Mate, for all the other tumot, you're required to go into a mikveh or to have water poured upon you, spring water sometimes it's mikveh water, mayim chayim or may mikveh. But for Tumat Mate, the mikveh is insufficient. You need, in addition, to receive what's called mechatat. That's the story of the para aduma, of the red heifer, the ashes of which are commingled with water, with spring water, and poured upon the recipient who's going through the process of purification on the 3rd day and the 7th day of the 7-day period. So that's unique again to Tamei Mate. In short, there's some other features of Tamei Mate that are special, but in short, so in the first perek of Keilim, which is an introduction to Seder Tarot in general, which lists the various levels of ritual impurity, the highest on the list is the Tamei Mate. Death is a source, perhaps the main source of Tumah is death and things related to death. That is in some broad sense, that's the list in the first chapter of Keilim, which, as I said, is an introduction to Seder Tarot in general. Now, in this list, in the first chapter, which lists the various tumot, let me mention another kind of tumah, not as severe as Tamei Mate, but high up on the list, and that is known in the tradition as tumah hayotze migufo, tumah which comes from the person. That is to say, you didn't contract the tumah because you came into contact with something else. The Tamei Mate is someone who has either touched the corpse or been in the same room as the corpse or whatever. But there are tumot which has to do with the person himself or herself. And that's called tumah hayotze migufo. And the 4 main tumah hayotze migufo are this. There's the zav and the zava. The zav and the zava have some kind of genital flow. The zava, it's blood. Blood at excessive blood at a time when it's unexpected, the details of which are not important right now. That's the zava, as opposed to the nida, that's menstrual blood, which is normal, but which also renders the woman impure. So there's nida and there's zava, and the male counterpart is zav, some kind of a genital flow. And then there's also the woman that gives birth, who also is ritually impure, the yoledet. So there's zav and zava and nida and yoledet, and perhaps we throw into the mix one more tumah hayotze migufo, which is more complicated, and that is the so-called mitzora. We'll call it the leper. Has all kinds of special features, but those 5 cases are not about being in contact with something. The zava and nida is not ritually impure because she came into contact with the blood. She's ritually impure because she's a zava or a nida. The zav is similar. It's not about contact. That's known in the tradition as tumah hayotze migufo. And that has, again, special features. One of the special features of tumah hayotze migufo, not all of them, but let's say the zav and the zava. The special feature of zav and zava is, and the yoledet as well, the woman who gives birth as well, one of the special features is, first of all, they have to count 7 days. It's not just about going to the mikveh. You have to count out the days, 7 days. And in the case of the zava and the zav and the yoledet, at the end of the period, there are sacrifices that they bring. That's unique. The Tamei Mate doesn't bring sacrifices, by the way, but the Zava and the Zav and the Oledet and the Mitzorah, of course, bring sacrifices to terminate the period of ritual impurity. That's one special feature of these people that are called Tuma Hayotze Migufo. And then there's another very interesting special feature that has relevance to this tractate later on. And that's, for example, let's say the Zav is Metame Tumas Mishgav Umoshav. What is Tumat Mishgav Umoshav? So the Torah talks about whatever the Mishgav of the Zav, the Nida, what they sleep on, the bed that they're lying on, for example, doesn't have to be a bed. What they're reclining on, what they're leaning on, what they're resting on, that itself becomes Tameh. In the case of the Zav, for example, the Talmud speaks of not just let's say their Zav is lying on a set of mattresses, 10 mattresses. The mattresses become Tameh. The mattresses become an Av HaTumah. And not just the mattress that the Zav is lying upon, not just the top mattress, but all of the mattresses. So it's not then a question of coming into contact with, because the bottom mattresses are not in contact with the Zav. At most, they're in contact with the mattress above, with the highest mattress, but that wouldn't make the other ones an Avatuma. That would make them a Rishon Latuma if it's a matter of just touching. So it's not a matter of touching. It's a matter of the Mishgav, the Merikav, the Mishgav becomes an Avatuma. So sometimes you could become an Avatuma not simply through touching, but because you have a certain status. The situation gives the object a certain status. There are other examples of this as well. Maybe we'll touch upon them. I'm mentioning all of this because it's important when you start Seder Tarot, this first chapter of Keilim, wherever Keilim really belongs in the order. The Rambam has Keilim. The next Rambam has 8 sections. In Torah, he has 8, some rather lengthy sections, where he has these laws. There are 12 tractates. The Rambam has 8 sections. Tumat Keilim is the next to last section in the Rambam. It's number 7. So where it makes total sense. It starts with the Avot HaTumah, the big Avot, Tumat Meit, Mitzorah, Mishkav Moshav, etc., etc. Then to the things that are tummy because they came into contact, food and vessels, ochim and kelim. So that's where the Rambam has it. But chapter 1, in any event, is the general introduction. So we have these different levels of tumah. Now, what's interesting over here is that the first 5 mishnayot of the first chapter deal with levels of tumah. What's interesting, though, is that what about starting in Mishnah number 6? Mishnah number 6, very famous Mishnah, Eser Kedushot Hein. There are 10 levels of sanctity. And the first of the 10 levels, it goes, again, from the least sacred to the most sacred. So the least, Mishnah number 6 is Eser Kedushot Hein, Eretz Yisrael Mikudeshet Mikol Ha'aratzot. The land of Israel is holier than all the other lands. The land of Israel has a certain kedusha to it. And the Mishnah says, Umehi kedushata. In what is this kedusha? How does this kedusha manifest itself? Mishnah number 6. Shemavien mimena ha'omer va'bikurim u'shtei halechem. Masha'ein mavien kein mikol ha'aratzot. Mishnah number 6. What's so special about it? That you bring from Israel the Omer. That's the offering that's brought, the Omer offering. We have Sfirat to Omer. Our tradition is the day after the first day of Pesach. We Machmat HaShabbat, which is interpreted rabbinically to mean the day after the first day of Pesach, the 16th day of the month. We bring the Omer sacrifice, which allows you to eat the produce of the produce that was harvested prior to the Omer. Bikurim, the first fruits that are brought. You bring the first fruits to the temple. The Torah describes it at the end of the book of Devarim, chapter 26. There's even a special recitation That's the bikurim. Ushtei alechem. What is shtei alechem? The two breads. The two breads are the special sacrifice that is brought on the holiday of Shavuot. A very special sacrifice. First of all, they have lechem, the chametz, which is typically not allowed generally in sacrifices, with rare exceptions. We don't have chametz, but shtei alechem is chametz, and that's brought on the holiday of Shavuot, and that permits sacrifices to be brought from the new crop. It's sort of the parallel to the Omer. So the land of Israel has a special kedusha because you have these, and the Mishnah mentions these three things: the Omer and shtei alechem, and also bikurim. And when you read this Mishnah, I'm hardly the first to notice this. What is the question one can ask is, when we're giving levels of sanctity, and the first of the 10, the lowest level, is the land of Israel, which is holier than the other lands, I could think of many other mitzvot that we could mention, which are specific to the land of Israel. Truma. Truma is given from crops that grow in the land of Israel. Maser, the tithe given to the Levi, and Trumat Maser, the tithe given from the tithe, and Orla, the fact that the first 3 years that the tree is growing, the fruit of the tree is forbidden for 3 years. But the Mishnah doesn't mention any of those things. The Mishnah only mentions 3 ways in which 3 manifestations of the sanctity of the land of Israel above and beyond other lands: the Omer, Shtei Alechem, and the Bikurim. Why does the Mishnah mention these 3? And of course the answer is clear. Because the Omer and the Bikurim and the Shtei Alechem, you bring them as sacrifices in the temple. The Omer and the Shtei Alechem are straight out sacrifices. And even the Bikurim. Bikurim is brought to the temple. It's placed down before the altar. There's a recitation. It's given to the priest. Bikurim, it would appear from the Mishnah, is in the same category as the Omer and Shtei Alechem. It's not the same as Truma. Truma is given to the local priest. Masa is given to the local Levi, etc. Orla is given from you refrain from the crops in your field. It's not sacrificial. There's no sacrificial side to it. The Mishnah is talking about the Esek Kedusha, means 10 levels of sanctity, which are either directly related to the temple or in the temple, or things related to the temple. And when you get to the list of the various spaces, for example, the highest Kedusha is the Holy of Holies. Holy of Holies. The priest only enters the Holy of Holies once a year. On Yom Kippur, the priest is entering the Holy of Holies and only bringing very special sacrifices to allow the entrance, and the incense is brought, etc. In general, one thing we can take from the Mishnah is holiness has to do with restrictions. What are the holy days in the holy sacred time? What marks something as sacred time? The holiest day on the calendar is Shabbos. Yom Kippur is in second place, and the other festivals. What makes Shabbos the holiest day? The answer is it has the most severe restrictions when it comes to work. So restrictions of work render something holy. Hanukkah is not a holy day. It's a holiday, but it's not a holy day, because one is permitted to work on Hanukkah and Purim. Then there are other days. Rosh Chodesh, there's really no prohibition to work on Rosh Chodesh. So there's something to it, the special sacrifices, but it doesn't have real Kedusha. Kedusha has to do with restrictions. So what's interesting is, and we have the list over here, the Holy of Holies, you only go in once a year. And that only the Kohen Gadol, and only under certain conditions. The more restrictions, the greater the sanctity. And this is actually now, if we step back from the Mishnah over here, in this brief introduction, we ask ourselves the question, why is this 10 Kedushot over here found in chapter 1 of Tractate Keilim? After all, one would expect this Mishnah would be found in the beginning of Kodshim, Zvachim. We have a whole Seder about sacrifices. We have animal sacrifices, Tractate Zvachim. We have flower offerings, Menachot. That's where it belongs. Why is it found in Tractate 1, first chapter of Tractate Keilim? And so what would appear from the Mishnah, which is a very important point, is that the Mishnah is representing, places before us as we study Tarot, two different things which are related in the sense they're opposite. There is Tumah and there is Kedusha. The modern person who talked about this at great length was actually Jacob Milgram. In his massive work on Vayikra, what Milgram points out is that the opposite of Tumah is not Tara. What Milgram points out is that in the Chumash, the opposite of Tumah is actually Kedusha. And he makes this a very central point in his understanding of the temple and the defiling of the temple, etc. And what's interesting, he points out about Tumah and about Kedusha, is that Tumah and Kedusha actually are, one might say, contagious. In other words, the idea of Tumah is something which is Tameh, causes other things that come in contact with Tumah to themselves become Tameh. And Kedusha, at its core, is similar. Coming in contact with the sacred can make something sacred. Now, I'm not going to get into how this plays out at this point, but that idea of Tumah and Kedusha being connected, or I say being opposite, that is really implied by the Mishnah. And this actually leads us to something else, which is, as one is beginning to look at Seder Tarot, there's a very basic question. Seder Tarot is about Tumah, things that make you Tameh. And the question is there a prohibition to become Tameh? Is Tumah something that a state that you may contract, and then you have to deal with it? But if you contract Tumah, then there are ways to rid oneself of Tumah. And if you contract Tumah, there are restrictions. You can't do this, you can't do that, etc., etc. So Seder Tara is telling us what things can make you Tameh, and of course, at the same time, how one escapes from this particular state. But what about if someone says, I don't want to escape from it, I don't care? Is it forbidden to become Tameh? Or no, simply, there's no prohibition of being Tameh. It's just if you are Tameh, these are the restrictions. So here we have something very, very interesting. If one opens up the Chumash, without the rabbinic tradition at all, just reads the Chumash, what is clear when you read the Chumash, what would appear from a plain reading of the Torah is that it is forbidden to be Tameh. Or maybe more precisely, it's forbidden to remain in a state of impurity. One can contract Tumah, typically, even without one's knowledge. You don't have to there's no intentionality for the most part needed to contract Tumah. You're walking in the street, you touch by accident a dead carcass of an animal, you become Tameh. Animal carcass is typically an Ava Tumah. If you touch it, you're a Rishon with Tumah. You didn't intend to necessarily contract the Tumah, but in fact you are Tameh. And then the question is how one rids oneself of Tumah. There's the mikvah. Tractate Mikvot is one of the tractates in Seder Tara, and it tells us ways in which we can rid ourselves, the person or the vessel or whatever, can rid oneself of this state of impurity. But is it prohibited to become Tameh? So the funny thing is, when you read the Chumash in more than one place, the plain reading of the Torah would suggest certainly that maybe it's not forbidden to become Tameh, maybe it is, but certainly to remain in that state. You have to rid yourself of that state. I'll give you 3 examples where it's pretty clear that the Torah is saying, the plain reading of the Chumash is saying that it's forbidden to be tamei. Let's take, for example, in no particular order, let's take, for example, in the book of Bamidbar, in chapter 19. Chapter 19 in the book of Bamidbar is where the Torah talks about the red heifer, the parah aduma, the person who became tamei mate, who became ritually impure by coming in contact with a corpse. And the Torah speaks about the red heifer in the beginning of chapter 19 of Bamidbar, the process of burning the heifer, the ashes which are necessary to be combined with the water was called mei chatat, which is sprinkled on the one who was ritually impure on the third and seventh day of the impurity. And then there's the mikvah, and that renders the person pure. Right. The Torah says in chapter 19 of Bamidbar, anybody who touches a corpse is ritually impure for 7 days. And then but you have this parah aduma, the waters called the mei chatat of the parah aduma. He must be purified, cleanse himself with it on the third and seventh day. And then it says, whoever came in contact with the corpse who did not engage in this ritual purity, et mishkan Hashem timei, has defiled God's tabernacle. V'nichrita hanefesh ahi b'Yisrael, ki meida lo zorakalov tamei yeh, o tumato bo. Whoever touches the corpse and does not cleanse himself has defiled the tabernacle. That person shall be cut off from Israel. Karet, serious punishment. Since the water, mechatat, was not dashed on him, he remains unclean. His uncleanliness is still upon him. The rabbinic understanding of that is, if you became tamei and didn't cleanse yourself, and then entered the temple, then this karet. Tamei is not allowed to enter the temple. But is that what the Torah actually says? It's very unclear. It sounds like, so it can be read as, the fact that one stayed in a state of impurity, one then becomes liable, because one is not permitted to stay in a state of impurity. That's chapter 19 of the book of Bamidbar. Let's find another couple of examples of where the Torah speaks about ritual impurity. The 11th chapter of the book of Vayikra, that's where you have a very lengthy discussion and a relevant discussion for us of Keilim, because that's one of the two places where the Torah speaks about vessels becoming ritually impure. That's chapter 11 of the book of Vayikra. Verse number 24 talks about Uli'ela titamau. These things, whoever touches these things shall become unclean. And it gives a list. Whoever touches them shall become tamei. And then it says, once again in verse number 28, Hanosei, one who carries these things shall become tamei. Once again, there's a list. And later on, Al tishak tzuat nafsho techem, verse number 43. B'chol hasheretz hashoretz, v'lo titamu bahem v'nitmeitem bam. Al tishak tzu, do not draw abomination upon yourself through anything that swarms. Do not make yourselves unclean therewith and become unclean. Ki ani Hashem Elohechem v'yitkadishtem v'yitem kadoshim ki kadosh ani. Because I am God that is holy, and you should be holy as well. When you read this chapter, it sounds like the Torah is saying, don't do it. It's not just saying that if you did it, you would become ritually impure. Do not do it. Again, why shouldn't become tamei? Because I am God that is kadosh. Once again, the contrast between kedusha on one hand and tumah on the other. Let's see if we can find one other example of this. Chapter 5, at the beginning of Vayikra, talks about different sacrifices. And different kinds of sacrifices. First, there's the burnt offering, the shlamim, welfare offering, and then there's sin offerings. And the Torah, different kinds of sin offerings. And the Torah says, "Nefesh ki techeta." If a person incurs guilt, and this is chapter 5, verse number 2. O nefesh asher tiga b'chol davar tamei, o b'nivrat chayat tmeya, o b'nivrat behemat tmeya, o nivrat sheres tamei, v'ne'ela mimenu, hu tamei v'yoshem. O ki tiga b'tumot adam, b'chol tumato, v'ne'ela mimenu, hu yodav v'yoshem. Among these things that require some kind of atonement are one who touches any unclean thing, or in verse number 3 of chapter 5, touches human uncleanliness. Such uncleanliness whereby one becomes unclean. Though he has known it, the fact has escaped him. Later he realizes his guilt. When you read the Chumash, it doesn't sound like the guilt is I entered the temple. It sounds like the guilt is the fact that I'm tamei, or perhaps remained in a state of impurity. That's the plain reading of the Chumash. But what's interesting is the rabbinic move. The Rambam makes this clear. The Rambam says, you want to be tamei, you can be tamei. You want to go to the temple, you have to purify yourself. You can't enter the temple. But being in a state of impurity per se, the Rambam says, in the rabbinic tradition, there's no obligation to be tar. If you want to do certain things, if you want to eat sacrifices, if you want to enter the temple, that's another story. But this question as to whether there is a prohibition of sorts of becoming tamei, that's a very interesting question. And I'll just conclude by citing a Gemara found in more than one place in the Shas. And the Gemara talks about the 3 festivals, the Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And the Gemara says, Chayav Adam l'tayr atzmo b'regel. Before these festivals, a person should purify oneself. Now, once again, it's not clear why. One could argue that one should purify oneself before the festivals, because on the festivals, the family typically would go to the temple. There are special sacrifices to be brought on the festivals, called the Olat Riyah, the Shamei Chagigah, the Shamei Simcha, other sacrifices as well. Can't bring sacrifices if you're ritually impure. Can't enter the temple if you're ritually impure. So that's certainly one possibility. But maybe it's something different. Maybe apart from that. Maybe it's the idea not so much of sacred space, but sacred time. Maybe then one should purify oneself to be in a state of purity in connection to sanctity, not just of the temple itself, but sacred time. The common practice of going to the mikveh for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur would be a similar idea. In short, as we embark upon Seder Tarot, it's important to keep this first chapter of Keilim in mind and the relationship of opposites, perhaps, between Tara on one hand and Kedusha on the other. For those that have been studying the Mishnah, and you got through the first 5 Sedarim, of course, Tarot is the most challenging. On the other hand, for those that have embarked upon the study of Mishnah and have somehow completed the first 5 Sedarim, there's that impetus, which I highly encourage, to try to complete all of the Mishnah, which includes the longest and the most complicated. But it's a great sense of satisfaction if one can actually complete the entire Mishnah. So I wish you all well, and as one studies through Tarot, then it's important, I think, to be able to understand what vessels these mishnayot are talking about. That's the big challenge. About different translations, they're very useful, and I wish you well. Next time we'll talk more about the specifics of Tractate Keilim once one gets out of chapter 1. Thank you all.